Well, now we have insights from one of the most ambitious and important, in my mind, processes in Australian history. Many of you might have witnessed similar undertakings in your own countries. Happening now, right now in Australia, over a number of years now, has been the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse. It's national, it is forensic, it has been investigating how Australian institutions like schools and churches and sporting groups failed and possibly continue to fail to respond to allegations of child sex abuse. And the evidence and the testimonies, if any of you in the room have been following along, have been gruelling and they have been heartbreaking and they have shone a light, finally, on a brutal truth in this country, and I'm sure it's the case in yours too, that child abuse is widespread, it's hidden, and in many cases it's been institutionalised. And as we all know, the personal toll of that is enduring and distressing into adulthood, and it underlies so many mental health challenges that you're navigating and working with, and we don't talk about it enough. The substrate that is trauma in childhood. And many people will walk into your services feeling that history very rawly, and it kind of goes in cycles, doesn't it, in their lives. So to speak to childhood trauma and recovery, learning from Australia's Royal Commission, is the incredible Professor Helen Milroy. She's a leading child and adolescent psychiatrist. She is serving as a commissioner on this Royal Commission. She's a descendant of the Palku people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia, but she was born and educated in Perth. Before this role, she was the Winthrop Professor and Director of the Centre for Aboriginal Medical and Dental Health at the University of Western Australia, and a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist with the Specialist Aboriginal Mental Health Service at Greylands Hospital in Perth. She is on numerous committees. She plays countless leadership roles. I'll urge you to look at her bio. But she was just saying at the table that her own feeling about her own practice will never be the same after her commission role. So please welcome her.
Whew. Thank you, Natasha. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see some familiar faces and also some new faces. Lovely to have our international guests here. Isn't Sydney one of the most beautiful cities in the world? Come on, everyone agrees. But where I come from in Perth, that's the best place to live in the world, okay? Just to get that in the mix. Thank you so much for the organising committee for inviting me along to speak today. We could speak about this topic all day, all week, all year. In fact, we've been talking about it in the Commission now for 5 years, and for many, many years prior to the setting up of the Royal Commission. Before I get started with the presentation, however, though, I just want to acknowledge that we are on traditional Aboriginal land, and beneath us are thousands and thousands of years of Aboriginal history. So I do acknowledge the Gadigal people from the Eora Nation, and also any of my Indigenous colleagues, both from Australia and our international Indigenous colleagues from all over the world. I did want to just pay particular mention of our international Indigenous guests who are here with us today, and just to acknowledge Renee Linklater, Laurie LaFontaine. I'm not very good at pronouncing names, by the way, so please forgive me. Tanya Antis, Donna Blair, Carol Koha, Tangi Numutu, Manu Sion, Tammy Wilson, Monique Faliafa, and also wanted to mention my great mate Tom Karma, who I believe you heard speak yesterday, and also the other Indigenous guests that we have from Australia. Okay, so today I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about the Royal Commission, because hopefully most of the Australians know what we've been doing, and you've probably been following some of the commentary in the press. And so for our international guests, I'll only just give a brief overview. And then I want to get stuck into mental health services and perhaps some of the things that I really want to bring out about my own personal reflections, having been a clinician for some 30 years in health services and mental health services, and now for the last 4 years being in this completely different world. In fact, I was saying to someone, I've been living in a foreign country for the last 4 years. It's called Lawyerland. I don't even understand the language and I need a translator. So I'm really glad to be back with my own tribe today in the mental health community. So thank you for inviting me along. I'm going to start with a story. This story is actually in the first part of the Working Together book, which I think you all got in your packs. This was a story that my mother gave to me some years ago for the purposes of looking at mental health in a slightly different way. So I'm just going to narrate the story, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about a different interpretation that I'm making of it in light of my experience with the Royal Commission. So the little green frog sat on the edge of the waterhole, watching the ripples in the water. It was so beautiful and clear, you could almost see the coloured stones lying on the bottom, except the movement of the water put them out of focus. The little green frog longed to swim to the bottom, but he knew it was too deep. It was very deceiving because the water was so pure. He would love to have collected some of the coloured stones. Suddenly, a large barramundi swam into the waterhole and rested on the colourful stones. "Are you looking at my pretty stones, Frog?" asked the barramundi. "Yes," Frog replied. "I'm too small to swim to the bottom of the waterhole, but I would love to have one." Barramundi swam to the surface with a bright red stone in his mouth. "Here is a present for you, Frog," he said, giving the frog the red stone. "Oh, thank you, Barramundi, but I haven't got a present for you." "You can give me one of the blue flowers that grow on the rocks," Barramundi said. Frog picked a blue flower and gave it to Barramundi. "The pretty stones you see I have been collecting since I was very young," Barramundi said. "They are all my memories. The red stone is full of happy ones." "Oh, thank you. I will treasure it always," said Frog. Each day Frog would visit the waterhole. Each day Barramundi would give Frog a pretty stone. In turn, Frog gave Barramundi a lovely flower. The little frog was enjoying the beautiful coloured stones as they made him feel very happy, so he actually didn't go back to the waterhole for quite some time. Then he finally said, "I will go and visit my friend today," he thought, and he set off for the waterhole where his friend Barramundi lived. Barramundi, at this time, was floating on the top of the water with a black stone in his mouth and surrounded by half-dead and rotting flowers. You can't give away your past memories. You need to keep them to be able to see your future. There are many ways of understanding that story, but in view of the work I've been doing with the Royal Commission, I've had a new understanding of it. As trust is developed, it's the black stones that will emerge in the stories. If we are not there and not ready to hear and understand those stories, it can have catastrophic consequences, as we've seen many times in stories, many times in services when people have ultimately suicided. This is why the bearing of witness is so important. Stories build a picture for us, which we cannot make sense of until we hear all of the stories. Building that coherent narrative is what helps us build hope. So, that's a picture of all the commissioners, the 6 of us that have been tasked with the job of setting up and running the Royal Commission. There's a couple of lawyers, a judge. Andrew Murray was from Western Australia, who was a politician who also did the child migrant inquiry. Myself as a clinician, and Bob Atkinson was an ex-police commissioner from Queensland. So we're a mixed bunch of people. And we've had 3 roles. The first was to bear witness to all of the stories of people's experiences in childhood, to look at a just response for victims, and to help build safer communities for children. We went about the work by 3 pillars. First of all was to develop what we called private sessions, which was a process where we could actually hear in a very safe way and a very empowering way the stories of people, and that's what I want to focus on today. We also have done a lot of public hearings, which I'm sure certainly people from Australia have been aware of, and we've had a huge policy and research development area as well. So how many stories have we been listening to? This is probably an old number. I think we're closer to 7,000 stories now. That's a lot of stories of trauma, and it's the tip of the iceberg. All of the stories are very traumatic, and they're given freely. We've also done quite a few prisoners. We've been to all of the major prisons across Australia, and we've certainly heard stories from hundreds of men and women in prison. In fact, 60% of all of the people coming to private sessions are men. And that's normally a voice we don't often hear from in regard to these sorts of issues. And so that's been a very important development, I think, in the work of the Royal Commission, is actually being able to engage with men. We've also had hundreds of written accounts of people's stories as well. We've still got just under 2,000 people to see this year. We've referred a lot of matters to the police. We've published 33 case studies, and we've actually, I think we're on to our sort of 50th or 51st case study as of next week. We've released lots of research reports and issues papers, and we've had a lot of engagement with the broader community. This is a massive amount of work that we've undertaken, and I think there's been a massive amount of change already throughout the life of the Commission. I'll talk a little bit more about the way we've developed our private session model, but I just want to talk a little bit initially about some of the issues that we see commonly, which I think are not well recognised. And the first one is around suicide. This comes from an academic paper, but it's been borne out within the private sessions that we also hear. That child sexual assault is a common issue when it comes to suicide, and yet when we look at a lot of suicide prevention programs and the way suicide is managed, child sexual assault is not even considered. There really aren't many reasons why a little girl of 10 years old in a remote community is going to want to hang herself. But sexual assault is one of them. And until we really come to understand that link, we're missing the point. A lot of people in our private sessions have told us they were suicidal from a young age. Their attempts started in primary school. It continued throughout their lifetime, and it resurfaced again in old age. We've had many people tell us they will not go back into care because of their experiences in early life. They would rather die than go back into care as an old person. So this sort of problem never really goes away, and until we actually deal with it well, it won't go away. And until we are able to deal with it in an obvious and wholehearted way in terms of recognising the link that trauma makes, we are missing the point. So if we look at sexual assault and mental health, as Natasha mentioned, significant childhood trauma, as we know from most studies, is a risk factor for adverse outcomes right across the developmental domains and right across anyone's life outcomes. It affects people's capacity to learn at school. It affects people's capacity to relate to others. It affects mental health in very significant ways. It can be the underlying driver of many of the mental illnesses that we see in mental health services. And I think this is where I get so frustrated. We've had many people come to us in the private sessions and say, they treated me for my depression, but they wouldn't deal with the trauma. I don't know how you can do that. I actually don't know how you can do that. We've had people say that they went to drug and alcohol rehab services 5 times, but it wasn't until someone dealt with their sexual assault in childhood that the drug and alcohol rehab worked. What a complete waste of time that was for everybody, but most of all for that poor person who was trying to navigate a system that didn't work. So it can be a risk factor for just about anything, or it can be an associated problem that raises its head from time to time throughout a person's life and causes all sorts of havoc. It certainly underlies a lot of alcohol and substance misuse, particularly when this sort of behaviour starts early in childhood. And what we most often hear is that kids start using substances at the age of 10 to try and dampen the memories of abuse. There's not that many other reasons why young children would be using substances. It also fuels a lot of feelings of mistrust, a sense of isolation and alienation, and those issues of isolation become worse with age. A lot of people have told us the only time they really feel safe is when they're on their own. That's very sad, particularly given that people end up living more and more isolated lives. And yet we know that what brings us the greatest joy is when we connect with others and have that shared experience throughout life. And it also causes a lot of shame and guilt, a lot of feelings of self-blame, and it causes a lot of stigma. In particular, a lot of men have told us that they haven't wanted to talk about their experiences of sexual abuse for fear of being labelled a potential perpetrator. So there's still a lot of misunderstanding about abuse, as we know that most people who have suffered these sorts of experience will never go on and abuse anybody. But there's still this misunderstanding. So men don't seek help because of that fear and the shame that goes along with that. And so they then have these unresolved issues. One of the biggest reasons why men have come to us in the Royal Commission, in fact, many men have said to us, I would never have told my story had it not been for the Royal Commission. And I'm not coming to seek help, but I'm coming because I want to make sure this doesn't ever happen to another child. So instead of coming as a help seeking, they're coming as help giving. And I think we need to take that on board, because none of these men were accessing mental health services, and yet they weren't doing well. Where were we? Where were we in engaging this group of people who had so much need and would have benefited from a compassionate response? Ultimately, what did happen was the men then engaged in an empowering way. They told their stories, and guess what? They engaged with services, and they're now actually receiving the help that they so badly needed. And we've seen a lot of really positive outcomes, and that's very true of our prison system as well. In fact, when we first engaged with corrective services, they said, no, we're not going there, we're not opening that can of worms, we'll just have all of these bad things happen in prison. Well, exactly the reverse happened. We did engage, we did support the men through this journey in prison, and a lot of them now are doing really well and are actually getting into programs, and some of their behavioural management problems that they had in prison prior are no longer there. So it's actually had a very positive outcome, and that's true for women as well. So I think this issue of not wanting to deal with sexual abuse still remains a problem throughout all services, throughout, in particular, mental health services, but throughout all of our environments of care where people find themselves. It's like the final taboo, and our default position is always one of denial or repression. So there are lots and lots of issues related to sexual abuse. One of the things we found through the course of our work is that the average time from when the abuse occurred to disclosure, anyone want to guess how long it takes? Yeah, 22 years is the average. Some people that have come to us were in their 90s, first time they disclosed. So the average is only part of the story. Some people it takes 40 years, 50 years. Some people have also told us that they've been seeing their mental health worker, their psychiatrist, their counsellor for 20 years. Did you tell your worker what happened to you? No. Why not? And it's an interesting discussion that you can have with these people coming to talk to us. And they have a variety of reasons. One, they thought they didn't know if it was relevant because no one had sort of really given them any understanding about the connection between their childhood and their later mental health problems. They thought they wouldn't be believed. They felt ashamed. They thought their psychiatrist wouldn't be interested. So there's a lot of problems that we still have in this even coming to the surface. What we've also learned from the private sessions is that this causes a lifelong impact, even for people who have done reasonably well, even for people who on most sort of socioeconomic measures are doing really well and are successful. This never goes away. This comes back. And I think the really, really sad part about this kind of early childhood trauma is that as we age and as our defence mechanisms start to become less effective, and in particular if we get other age-related diseases like dementia, trauma rekindles. So not only do you suffer in childhood, but you suffer in old age. And for some people, I think, you end up dying trapped in those memories. That's a very sad state of affairs. We still do not know how to treat this well. We also know that for a lot of people that have come to us as well, despite many years of treatment, despite many years of good therapy, and I'm not saying everyone has had a bad experience with mental health services, some people feel that they owe their life to the good work of many clinicians, many hard-working clinicians in the mental health sector. But there's this permanency of the traumatic memory that we still haven't really been able to get past. And I don't care about all of the evidence based in CBT. It does not stop the traumatic memories from coming back. We have this chronic hypervigilance and burnout that people experience over their life. And we also have the loss of simple things like joy and peace and the ability to know what true love is. And I think that's a terrible tragedy for a child to lose those sorts of things. in their development. There's huge difficulties in relationships, parenting and attachment, and of course that then gets transmitted on to the next generation. We also know that people will decompensate throughout their lives at various points as things trigger or other events happen, and you get that culmination of previous trauma with a new trauma. Some of the other learnings of private sessions come from looking then at how did people survive this? When I have sat there and listened to some of these stories, I can't believe it. I can't believe the courage, the resilience, the survival. And I think to myself, I don't know that I would be sitting here if I had experienced what you had. And it's really sobering, and it makes me feel incredibly humble at times when I listen to these journeys. So I always ask people about what got them through, and we get some very common themes that emerge. One of them is having a safe person to talk to, someone who feels that they can speak to in a way where they'll be believed, where they'll be validated, where they'll have some sense of compassion. That notion of enduring relationships is also really important, and yet most often in our service provision, we don't have enduring relationships. We have disconnected relationships with people throughout their life. It's very rare that a person can go through mental health services without having to deal with multiple people over multiple years. That's very rare for someone to actually have anyone continuous, particularly in the public sector. Sometimes people have a natural ability to have hope. They never lose their hope despite everything that's happened to them, and I find that remarkable. Having a sense of mastery also sees people get through things. So being good at something, always being able to do something or achieve something in their life. And we also know that trauma does disrupt a child's ability to develop mastery, which can then leave a lifelong deficit as they continue through adulthood. And having some kind of purpose as well, having some sort of sense that maybe they endured all of this and maybe it can be used for good sometime in the future. And for, I think, many people that have come to us and told us their story, that's exactly what has happened. They have felt empowered and purposeful in coming to us knowing that their story may actually protect another child. We've also been able to understand people in terms of their healing journeys, and their healing journeys are not linear. They go forward, they go backwards, they go round in circles. They also have these transition points where things happen or they're at a developmental stage when you can intervene more effectively, or there can be a change that produces a real opportunity for recovery. And we also know that there are turning points as well. There are turning points in people's lives because of coming into contact with someone else or a service or something else that's happening in the environment. And we have to understand all of those things because these are all opportunities to enhance people's lives, and I don't think we make enough of them. When we look at the treatment of sexual abuse, part of the problem with our systems of care is you need a diagnosis. And that's really fraught, isn't it? I mean, I think someone mentioned a comment today that someone had in their presentation yesterday said we are more than a set of symptoms and we are more than a diagnosis, and that's absolutely true. And yet our criteria for service provision is all around diagnostic criteria. I think it's amazing that a child who has suffered severe assault in childhood may be excluded from a child mental health service because it doesn't fit a diagnosis. So what you could do is just stick a label on the child and say they've got PTSD and suddenly they're eligible. It's just crazy. We just shouldn't have to do that. But when people do end up in mental health services, often they don't disclose their child sexual assault, and there's a number of reasons for that. It may be acknowledged, but it's often left untreated. It may even be written in the notes, and yet it's not considered in any sort of formulation or plan, or even given any sort of thought about how the impact might be in regard to whatever else is presenting. There are very few child specialist services that deal with this issue. It's often ignored in drug and alcohol services, and I think the transgender impact of this stuff, particularly for our Indigenous communities, is often ignored and overlooked. And yet that's very significant. If we don't deal with the parent and then we don't deal with the children, we'll never break these cycles. And what we see so often in our stories through the private sessions is that this happened to one generation, there's child removals in the next generation, there's child removals in the third generation, there's child removals in the fourth generation. How do we deal with that? That takes a lot of effort. Be better to prevent it. So, now we're going to come to the challenges. I have been absolutely amazed at the response to the private session model that we've developed with the Royal Commission. It has been a very empowering process. So when people call us, they are supported right from the beginning. They're linked in with counsellors if they need to, or support people. They may have had quite a lot of hours of contact with people before they come to a commissioner and to actually tell their story face to face. And the process that we have developed for the telling of the story is based around a free narrative. It's not interrogative at all. We don't challenge the evidence. We just simply listen to their story. You know, it was really hard for me as a psychiatrist not to ask lots of questions. I really had to hold back and just allow the process to unfold. And what I have learnt is that it is so much better. You know, I used to do this with my Indigenous countrymen because the style of narrative and storytelling in the Aboriginal community is how you do an assessment. And so I would use that process when I worked in a cultural model, but I didn't use that process when I worked in the mainstream. And what I finally sort of really understood is actually this model is good for everyone. And we have seen everyone from all walks of life in the Commission. People who are wealthy, people who are poor, people who are homeless, people from all cultures. We don't know where we're going to start off as children. We don't know what's going to happen to us. So the cross-section of the population that we've actually interviewed is vast. So we developed this free narrative style which gives people the control over how they tell their story, and we try and follow a logical sequence from beginning to end, even though it does get a little bit backwards and forwards along the way. And rather than asking questions, we just clarify things along the way and we help people to join up all of the dots. We do a lot of acknowledgement and validation, and it's non-judgmental, and it's certainly compassionate. We also acknowledge the incredible bravery and courage that people bring when they come to us. And we also acknowledge and value the actual story, because without their story, we can't do our work. And I was thinking about the parallels with this and a psychiatric assessment. I will never do another psychiatric interview the way I used to. I'm sorry, it's gone. It's completely changed. I'll never go back to those old traditional models. They just don't work, and they don't reveal the richness of the information that you get from a much more empowering interviewing style and a much more empowering process in the way people can actually tell their stories. A psychiatric interview is disruptive. We start off with what's wrong with you, how long has it been going on for, then we might go back a bit, what else was wrong with you in the past, what meds are you on, then we might go back even further and say what happened in your family, then we come back to the present, then we start doing the mental state, which kind of goes all over the place and is very judgmental. Then we make sense of it all and we put it all together. So even our own process in an interview is disruptive. It's not a coherent narrative at all, and yet somehow we arrive at a picture at the end. What I found through this process is I've probably covered all of the things that I would actually cover in a psychiatric interview, but it's been in a much more logical sequence. It makes far better sense, and it builds a much more coherent picture of the person in front of me. Not only that, but it ends up being a shared journey, and that person doesn't feel that I've taken all of their stuff, but that they've actually given it freely. And it's a much better process. So, one of the things that I would like to challenge the audience with is how do we make the journey for the people that come to us in mental health services one of empowerment and true partnership? I don't think we can continue with these same models anymore. I really don't, particularly if we're going to understand and deal with the impact of trauma, which we know is a very, very high prevalence in the community of people that come and access our services. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is around, there's a real buzzword at the moment, isn't there? Trauma-informed care. Everyone heard about that? And it's really good. I think it's really good that we're starting to put a focus on it. But we need to go way beyond that. I do not accept that a mental health service that is meant to understand human development and the development of severe illness that can significantly impact on a person's life and their outcomes does not know how to deal with trauma. I do not believe that people should be sent away to a specialist sexual assault service because the mental health service can only treat their depression. I mean, that's just, I'm sorry, it's more insane than the people that actually have the mental health problems that are coming to us. So we need to really start talking about trauma competency within mental health services and drug and alcohol services. I don't believe it's that hard, but I think that there's an inherent resistance to wanting to deal with it, and people are so uncomfortable with it because there's still so much stigma and taboo associated with it. But you know what? When you deal with it well, it is so much better, and people do feel so much better. They can move on in their lives. They can then develop their own healing journeys, and you can walk along that path with them. So how do we get past this issue of just looking at it from a trauma-informed approach and actually developing some much better trauma competency skills within our services? How do we also facilitate disclosure? If people have been coming to mental health services for 20 years and have never disclosed, then there's something wrong. And it's not with the person coming. It's with the system of care around them. We've got to be able to facilitate disclosure in a real way. I can remember once trying to train registrars. I must have started off life in a very aberrant way because my first job as a very junior medical officer was as a forensic medical officer working in the child sexual abuse clinic. And the only reason I took the job on was because no one else would do it, and I tended to do that, you know, silly me. Anyway, it was a real eye-opener. And so I always tried to bring in an understanding of how you do disclosures when I train registrars. And I can remember one of the registrars, you know, trying to do an interview with a child and saying to the child, "Nothing bad's ever happened, has it?" I really don't think that'll facilitate disclosure. And as much as that's very overt, there's a lot of other subtle ways in which we shut people down and we avoid the really hard issues. And part of it is because we don't want to feel the sadness. The closest thing I can use to describe the experience I've been through for the last 4 years, having seen and heard and experienced thousands of stories of severe trauma, is like waiting around in evil. It's not a pleasant place to be. And the emotional reactions you have yourself are difficult, let alone for the poor person who's sitting in front of you. But we have to do that in order to understand and in order to then move that forward. And the thing that I always take away from the end of any session that we do is that you might wait around in that for a while, but you don't stay there. You then come out of it and you see the hope and you see the courage and you see the resilience, and you leave that session feeling wonderful. So it's not a bad thing to have to do the waiting, but we have to be prepared to go there. Otherwise we won't get anywhere. We'll just be tinkering around at the margins. So that's the second challenge. Let's deal with this properly, well, and let's all be able to move into a much better future. Because it's only through dealing with this we will be able to have a greater focus on prevention in the future as well. And then the third focus is about resilience. It was really nice to hear the strengths-based approach from our first speaker, and I really agree with that. But do you actually think services do it? I think some services probably do, but I think other services don't really know what it is. And what we've learnt a lot through the sort of private sessions is people's own sense of resilience and their own sense of strength. But I think we're still coming from the resilience building and the strengths-based approach in a quasi-negative model, in that we're teaching people how to be strong, or we're building resilience, but we're not recognising the inherent resilience and strength within the person. And that's what has been, I think, so wonderful about this free narrative approach, is actually being able to hear people's real story about themselves rather than just the problems. And I just don't know that we fully understood what resilience is in terms of the unique nature of it within each individual. And that resilience is dynamic and it's a two-way shared model. And resilience is shared amongst teams and amongst communities and amongst people. And sometimes we can help other people be resilient through our own strength. So the third challenge is, how do we get a better understanding of the unique strengths of each person and build that into the process of healing and recovery? I've been really amazed again, I must say, at what people tell us towards the end of the session, when we do start talking a little bit more about some of the things that they found really helpful or some of the hopes and dreams and aspirations that they have. And they really are remarkable and not what you would expect. I have to say, when I started with the Royal Commission, I had already heard thousands of trauma stories through my experience in mental health services and my, sort of my specialisation in child trauma. And I thought I'd heard it all. I really did. I did start off with that mindset. And that very quickly dissipated. And I have to say that every story is unique. Every story has a power and a value. And I have learnt something from every single session that I have done. And I also think that what we fail to do in mental health services as clinicians is we fail to acknowledge the valuable contribution that everyone that comes to see us is making to our development. I'm only standing here with the expertise that I have because of all of the stories that I have listened to. So I wouldn't even have that knowledge if I hadn't understood those stories. And I don't think we even thank the people that come and see us for that, because it's a gift. We just see that they're here and we're going to help them. But in actual fact, they're helping us. I just wanted to finish on saying that there is a better way forward. There is a brighter future. So if we have this combination of trauma-informed and competent care, we have to understand the context of people's lives. We have to understand what they've been through. We also have to have a cultural lens. I fully agree with all the cultural competency that we've got to do. We've got to help craft and create the right story. And within strong relationships. And then we can do our once upon a time. Okay, I've done now.
Helen Milroy. Wow, so much to explore there. I feel that I might just open it to the room, because time is against us and I want to maximise the time that you have with Helen, given her expertise. Hello, thank you. Can we get a mic there? And please put your hand up throughout so we can move.
I know
mics
this
to
fella.
One over there.
Hello.
Hi, Damien.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
Great to see you. Something that I want to pull out that from your presentation, plus also I've gone through the preliminary report, is around the men's engagement. Men will engage if there is a safe space. And the Royal Commission is highlighting that process. You said something earlier that I applauded. We aren't creating safe spaces for men to access the services. Men aren't the problem. Men are not the problem. And I think there is a direct link between the lack of access to services for men and the suicide that we're seeing in these generations now. Men need to inform how you engage. If men aren't coming through your front door to access your service, they're not the problem. I was speaking to a gentleman yesterday from the UK, I don't know where he is speaking, but sometimes people forget that as men, we are also human, and we deserve and need a safe space to disclose and to feel comfortable to share. So thank you, Helen, through this process. That's something that I have been advocating for quite a bit on social media about, is that men are engaging, and men are engaging because they don't want it to happen again. So thank you.
And you know, one of the things that I really grapple with, thank you, and I've asked a lot of men this, is what are the messages that we need to give to boys to allow them to speak up? Because we still have this problem with this masculine culture, or ideas about boys, or the need to be tough, or to tough it out. And we need to find new messaging, I think, for boys that gives them a strength in speaking up. So you know, not to be shamed, but also to feel strong about speaking up. And I'm not sure we've got it right yet, because so many people still say that they wouldn't have spoken up had it not been for the Commission. So there must be a lot of men out there who still won't speak up. We haven't quite.
How do you replicate a commission-type impetus in regular life, you know? How do you do that?
Well, that's one of the dilemmas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Question over here, thank you, or comment or story or offering.
Kia ora, Helen. That was good to hear. And for the first time listening to you speak, I wondered about the issue of creating services that allow this kind of conversation to occur, and for this to be dealt with clearly and open-eyed. What do we do in terms of our recruitment and our training of staff, given the prevalence that we know of childhood sexual trauma? to address that in the people that we're hiring to work in mental health services?
Thank you.
I think it probably needs a multi-pronged approach. One of the issues, of course, is that we need to build in curriculum much earlier on so that it's actually across all university curriculums that deal with people who are going to come into either social or support or mental health or clinical services. I mean, if you think about the training in psychiatry, for example, there's not a lot on this. You might get a bit more if you do the child specialisation, but otherwise there's not a lot. And there's not a lot in the undergraduate medical degree either. So when you look at other curriculum development, there's a long way to go there. But I also think we've got to have a culture. We've got to have a cultural change in mental health service where we recognise that these sort of trauma stories are really important and need to come to the fore and need to be part of the whole experience and treatment of, or the whatever we offer in terms of helping people to come to terms with these sorts of things. We still can't keep our heads in the sand and deny that these things are there and are contributing. I mean, if someone has had traumatic flashbacks and nightmares for 10 years and they present to a mental health services with depression and all they get is antidepressants, I really don't think they're going to recover. And yet that's the response that they often get. So, we really have to have a different way of understanding this. Part of the problem is sexual abuse is not a diagnosis. It's an event, it's an assault, it's a trauma in the person's life, it's a violation of the self. But it's so fundamental to everything else that then happens that by failing to recognise it and deal with it wholeheartedly, we're just not being fair to the person coming to see us. So we need to do a lot more, and it also, I think, needs to be led by the people working in the services. One of the things that you have to be extremely careful about as well is burnout. And it's really hard working in this area. And one of the things that we did set up really well in the Royal Commission was a very, very good support network for the clinicians. Because if we don't stay buoyant and healthy, then we really can't help anyone else either. And I think that there's a lack of understanding of how important the need for expert supervision is for people working in these areas. We have clinical supervision, yeah, we know that. We have people looking over our shoulders. But I'm talking about that more one-on-one professional supervision where you can go to a safe place as a clinician and talk about how these things are affecting you.
Thank you.
Just prior to being appointed to the Royal Commission, I had been on lots of advisory groups and committees, and I said to myself, I'm sick of this. There's no power in this. Doesn't amount to anything. I've been yelling about children for years, and it seems to fall on deaf ears. So sometimes you need the might of something that has legislative backup and power to actually make a difference. The Royal Commission has that. It's 7 Royal Commissions because it's all states and territories and the Commonwealth. So it has a lot of legislative power behind it. I've actually learnt the benefit of lawyers now.
Yeah.
I failed to realise that before. So I think you need something that's really heavy-handed, and we can. In fact, I am diverting, but I have to tell you this story. When I first got my appointment to the Royal Commission, it said you shall be granted special powers. I wanted invisibility, but it didn't come. But we had the power to compel evidence, and we could compel it from everywhere. We had 5 archbishops in the room, in the courtroom, giving us their testimony. That's never happened anywhere in the world, I don't think, before, and it may never happen again. So it was powerful, and I wonder whether the New Zealand perhaps needs a Royal Commission with that sort of level of grant. What's also happened is this hasn't been a Royal Commission where everything's going to happen at the end. Every case study we've done, every research report we've released, we've already done our redress report, which the government's considering now in terms of a national scheme. There's already been changes. The statute of limitations, for example, has already changed in some states, and that will be part of also our criminal justice project. We've already seen dramatic change in society. I had a fellow who said to me, if I'd gone down the pub 10 years ago and said to my mates I was sexually abused, I would have been called, a faggot or been insulted in so many different ways. I would have been beaten up, I might have been ostracised. It would have been a terrible experience. He said, if I go down to the pub now and say to my mates, I'm going to the Royal Commission to tell my story, they'll say, good on you, mate. It happened to me too. So we've forever changed.
That's incredible. What's incredible is hearing you talk about the real-time impact as this commission is undergoing. That's profound. We have a question or comment here, and we also have one over here. Pop your hand up if you'd like to squeeze one in. Yep, and one here, and one here. Great.
Thank you. And Eduardo Vega from the United States. But very exciting to hear that you are recovering from psychiatry And in terms of really talking about the journey as a shared human, one of human empowerment partnership. And also, I wanted to kind of commend you for a note that I've been trying to sound here and there about challenging the psychiatric interview process. And I think this is something I would hope that many, many systems would take on. Because as somebody who's been through that on the patient side, but also been a counselor, I've been very clear that this litany of despair of what's wrong with you, what's been wrong with you, what's wrong with your family, what have you done poorly, where have you not succeeded, this litany of despair really reinforces a negative self-image and a power dynamic that is fundamentally dehumanizing. So I'm hoping that you will help lead the whole field in getting the interview, the intake process to be one that celebrates people's strengths, that goes to their values and what they want in life, and not just what has negatively happened to them. Because that in itself, I think, will transform our systems.
It's been really amazing to hear people's stories in a different way, and for the people themselves as well, because we've had an enormous amount of very positive feedback about this. And it's interesting to see how when the person is able to tell their story in their way, and we follow it and just get clarification along the way, and we arrive at the end point, and often the person says, wow, I've never understood that before. Because through that process of the free narrative and just that clarifying along the way, they actually understand themselves too. And that's often for them the first time that's ever been obvious.
Thank you. And I did have a question, actually. Okay. So what you're doing is so important, and what I'm wondering about, I'm thinking about, is all the abuses, including sexual and physical abuse, that happen within bounded systems, and in particular with protected populations, people who are institutionalized, severely multiply disabled, and these sort of things. How does your work, do you actively look into and work with those systems and their gatekeepers to explore abuse in the institutional setting?
Yeah, we have. We've had an amazing engagement team, and we've also had pretty good cooperation with systems as well, and we've tried to cover all institutions. We've had a huge focus on, of course, some of the more closed institutions, places like juvenile justice, closed psychiatric hospitals, for example, things like that. So, we have looked across the whole gamut. We haven't, unfortunately, been able to put every institution under the microscope in a public hearing, because that's just not possible. So we've tried to pick the public hearings which focus on a number of different factors or a number of different systemic issues, which are also replicated in other systems. And we've looked across everything from sporting groups through to churches, from orphanages, through the whole out-of-home care system, from just small, very local, kind of recreational organisations, right through to elite, dance groups and sporting clubs. So we've covered the full range.
I'm going to take the next two in a row, and that's what we'll wrap this wonderful session with. Thank you.
Just a very brief comment, and thank you for the great work that has been done. I suppose for me there's an element of how do we use this to support the approach to be taken out of service land and for it to become a community approach whereby dialogue can happen in informal networks that supports this. Because I think if it stays within service land and stays within those private sessions, we will never get to create healthy community. So for me it's around how can we take this forward in a way that creates action, whereby people are taking ownership and have that sense of empowerment, and it creates the healthy community that will prevent this in the future.
We do have a whole child-safe standards, which we've actually already released, and most institutions are already looking at that or incorporating it. And there is going to be a large focus as well on community prevention and what the needs of communities are in terms of communities being child safe. And I mean, at the end of the day, we need safe families, safe communities, safe systems, and safe governments that protects and upholds the rights of children to care and protection.
Yeah, and I think it's mainly for me, it's around how can conversations happen, how can that open dialogue happen, so people don't have to be ashamed, that they're able just to say things as it is, and whatever has happened can be explored and talked about in the present moment.
Yeah.
I think those dialogues are already happening in Australia because there's been so much media attention, there's been so much focus, on television and in all of the reports that we've released, in the public hearings and in all the stories. The other thing that will happen with the final report is that we will release a whole volume on stories so that people can actually go to those stories and learn from them, and there will be thousands. But I do think that the community conversations are already happening, and it will be part of the community awareness and the ongoing work sort of beyond the Royal Commission, I guess, in terms of that community awareness going forward and what needs to maintain the rage after we've gone.
Can we squeeze in one more comment? I think there was one here, and then I'll need to wrap. One at the front here. Pop your hand, wave it. There you go. Thanks.
Hi, Martin Rogan from Mental Health Ireland. Myself and Helen spoke last night, and this is a common theme across all IIMHL members, and I think a number of countries have succeeded in establishing commissions in Scotland, in Ireland, in New Zealand, and in Canada. I think our colleagues in England and Wales have run into successive difficulties trying to get this off the ground, and I think that's an interesting phenomenon in terms of the sabotaging effects that have come from different quarters there.
Yeah.
But I think, Helen, you've described it very well there in terms of the role of mental health services. Even if you look at Freud's work, often set out to explain away the instance and to discredit in some instances that this couldn't possibly be the case. So I think as mental health services we have an obligation to take ownership of how in some instances we may have colluded and perhaps camouflaged this phenomena. And I think maybe the special power we have had has been the power of invisibility, that we've actually cloaked this whole phenomena. So I think there is a bit of ownership, and I think it's a really healthy debate and a spectacular presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think one of the things I learnt very early on when I started working in this area as quite a young doctor is that I had to incorporate what I came to understand with the darker sides of humanity, still with hope and optimism about the future. And that's a hard thing to do, and I think it's not something that we voluntarily want to do, but we have to.
Helen, I just want to get a comment from you about how this work in and around child sex abuse translates to other experiences of trauma in childhood and outside of the institutional sphere. This focused in and around institutions in all their forms.
Well, when you look at the statistics, probably 80 to 90% of sexual abuse occurs within families or people known to the child. So we're only focusing on a small subset, but it was easier to focus on that in a way, but also the institutional response was so traumatising to people, and the duty of care was different. There's no doubt that there will be ramifications right across the field in regard to how this impacts on services and on understanding and all of that sort of thing. So, if you make changes to, say, the statute of limitations, that's across the board. It doesn't matter where abuse happened. It will apply to everyone equally. So there's a lot of crossover between that. But I also think that sexual abuse is the final taboo. People can sort of accept violence happens. People can sort of understand neglect, but they don't want to look at sexual abuse. The other issue is that people still have this kind of idea that sexual abusers are somehow these weird-looking people with, scars or something. And it's not. It could be the person next door. It could be your uncle. And so it's a fear that people don't want to take on because it's everywhere. But unless we have eternal vigilance, we actually won't understand the threat. And I don't want to make everyone scared, but we just need to make everyone safe. And if we take it from a positive view, then we'll do a lot better. But ignoring it and denying it, we can't go back to that state of denial that we had. So I think that the problem with focusing on other forms of abuse is that we then lose the focus on sexual abuse. And it's so easy to lose the focus here because we don't want to focus on it. And that's the problem.
And a final question to you is, for those in the room who want to follow up on some of the resources that you've named today, or would like to understand the framework more, where would they go?
Yeah, it's all on our website. You can search our website. There's lots and lots of things there, and we are due to do our final report at the end of this year, and then we'll cease to exist. I will become invisible. I'll disappear in a puff of smoke at the end of December, but that will be quite nice too.
More hanging around beside, rivers and on the land and taking some time out for yourself.
Painting.
Yeah. So please thank Professor Helen Milroy. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.